Like you, I'm a hobbyist, and like I'm sure all of you do, I have an obligatory pile of shame. Now, I recently moved, and that gave me a chance to organize and sort through my pile of shame, and while sorting through it, I found this Imperial Guard Shadow Sword that I've had lying around for years and had completely forgotten about. We all do that, right? With the new Games Workshop release of plastic Krieg models, this sparked an idea. I trawled eBay and my local buy swap sellers until I found this gem, a Krieg tank commander. With my newly found excitement for the saddest guardsman around, there was only one option. I would use this as a test model for my Krieg army of my own, and give this guy away to one of my supporters on Patreon. Stick around later in the video to find more about that. Due to this guy sitting around so long, he was a bit dusty, so I busted out one of my most used hobby tools, an old, cheap makeup brush. Now, I have multiple sizes of these. The large one I keep around purely for dusting models. Now, I was positive from the get-go that I wanted this guy to be nice and beat up, so the first step was to grab my airbrush, thin down some Games Workshop Rhinox hide, and shoot that across the entire model. This will serve as a base for all of our chipping when we put AK Interactive's Worn effects over the top of this. Once the Worn effects were dry, the first base coat color was applied. This is Games Workshop's Lauren Forest, a nice, deep, kind of murky green. The next color was Games Workshop's Elysian Green, also a very natural green, kind of a step up from Lauren Forest, but with more yellow added to it. If you don't have this, you could also try just adding yellow to Lauren Forest, or Castellan Green from Games Workshop creates a pretty similar result. Now, I'm going with a bit of panel modulation with the airbrush. By that you can see I'm kind of targeting the center of the panels, letting almost as if light's bleeding off from there. You can also see on the barrel of the weapon, when I paint that, I'm targeting just the top of it, so that really carves out the volume of that cylinder. This is where a bit of timing goes into this. You need to let those layers of green dry for long enough that you're not just going to wipe them away when you do this, but you don't want to leave it so long that the worn effects aren't as effective when you try to do this. I generally tend to, I will spray the greens as soon as the worn effects have dried. In my case, they dried relatively quickly because it's a bit warm here, probably about 15 to 20 minutes later. But after those green layers were down, I gave them about half an hour to 45 minutes to dry. Now you can see I just get a cup of clean water, a brush that I don't care about, and a towel to sponge off some of the excess water, and I just start going to town on the model. I'm trying to target certain areas, definitely around any edges and rivets, but I also want to add a little bit of interest, have some chipping appear in the middle of panels as well. Now, I did the next step off camera because I do not want to spray this stuff at my desk. I will stand at a window or outside and spray directly out of that to try and mitigate fumes inside my apartment. But you can see the model looks very, very different. And that's because I sprayed it with AK Interactive Streaking Grime through an airbrush. This was completely undiluted. I would recommend doing this with an airbrush that you don't care so much about. Because it being an enamel paint, it's a bit more aggressive on the O-rings within the airbrush. So it's nice to have a spare for that. Now, once that's dried, it doesn't take long at all, only a couple of minutes. I will pour some white spirit into a cup. You can use any white spirit, but my white spirit of choice is Windsor of Newton. I mainly just use that out of simplicity because I use that for my oil washes and whatnot as well. But once that's in there, I'll grab another brush that I don't care about and just start scrubbing away at the model. Now, you can do this in a couple of different passes. Sometimes I will just scrub away at a model with a brush and then go in with a Q-tip to really isolate areas where I want to pull more of that grime off and kind of show highlights more. Much like the last step, I didn't want to spray the next one indoors. So once the streaking grime and white spirit were dry, I sprayed the entire model with a Liquitex polyurethane matte varnish and waited for that to dry. The next step was for me to mix up an oil wash. This is about a 50-50 mix of Abteilung 502's black and burnt umber, thinned with that same white spirit that I mentioned before. All I did was went around with, once again, a brush that you don't care about. Never mix brushes that you use with oil with anything you would do with acrylic paints. And I went around and dotted all of the creases and crevices, all of the little joins between different panels, rivets, anything that you really want to accentuate some definition behind. I then took the exact same mix of oil paints, but without white spirit thinning it. And this is a good way to demonstrate just how easy oil paints can be to work with and how completely not scary they are. I simply mixed them, painted along the bottom of the tank because I had an idea that I wanted to have a bit of just dirt grime kind of coming up from the top, from the bottom. Painted it onto those bottom areas and then took another one of those small makeup brushes that I mentioned before and just dry brush, blended, feathered, whatever you would call it in. Oil paints blend incredibly easily, they feather incredibly easy. And the perfect part about them is their drying time is incredibly long. So you can work with them and kind of fuss around back and forth forever until you get them right. And if you feel like it's kind of too long gone, just add some white spirit to that brush and you can pretty much wipe it away completely. Now there were some areas of the tank that I felt like the chipping fluid hadn't naturally given me the emphasis that I wanted, especially on the front of the tank where you would have more natural scratching and chipping occur. So I went in with a brush just with Rhinox hide, same color as we used before, and just freehanded in some chips here and there. The next step was simply to get ready for every other step to come. I used Scale 75's black. It's a very matte black kind of gel-based paint, so it does act differently to your Games Workshops or your Vallejos, but I just thinned that down with a bit of water and base coated every part of the model that's not green. I then base coated all of the steel metallics. So I wanted this to kind of match with the more gritty, grimy theme, so I used more of a warm steel color that I have. This is one of my favorite metal colors. It's Vallejo Metal Color Exhaust Manifold. Once they were all dry, I gave all of the steel parts a very simple wash of just 50-50 black and brown wash. I then dry brushed, stippled, blended, feathered, highlighted all of the steel parts with a crappy busted up brush to give nice irregular patterns because I didn't want this to be a nice smooth blended steel. And I used Vallejo Model Air, I believe. Yeah, Model Air Silver. Then, just to give a little bit more interest to the black parts, I gave them a quick feathered layer of Vallejo Model Colors Dark Reaper. I then used Games Workshop's Thunderhawk Blue and Fenrisian Grey to give successive kind of scratches and edge highlights to those black parts. I then base coated the parts of the tank that I wanted to be bronze. This was namely the Aquillas with Scale Colors Decayed Metal. And then gave them a quick wash with the same black-brown mixture that we used on the steel. The next step was to give them a highlight, kind of in the same way as the steel, more stippled, less regular, kind of makes them more damaged and old looking. For that we used Game Color Brassy Brass. All of the straps and the face mask on the Krieg tank commander were base coated with Rhinox hide. Now this step will be a twofer because you can see that his armor has changed a bit, and that's because I couldn't show the footage because I was leaning in front of the camera the entire time. I essentially just blended Vallejo's intermediate blue successively in with the scale 75 black and kind of stippled on highlights. We then added some Mournfang brown and blended on some highlights to those pouches on the front and straps around the helmet on the Krieg commander. It would seem I really did not want to show you guys me painting the commander, but I added some white into that Mournfang brown and just successively added more and more highlights and scratches in smaller areas on those pouches. I then added a layer of Steel Legion drab to the face mask on the commander. Adding more and more of Vallejo's game color off-white, I slowly added layer upon layer of highlight to the face mask. I wanted to add some pops of color to the model, so using Games Workshop's Avalanche Sunset and Flash Gitz Yellow, I base coated all of the little wires, coils, whatever you want to call them, on the tank with the Avalanche, and then added a next layer of the Flash Gitz on it. I do apologize about the focus and angles on some of this, but it's a very big model to film on camera and paint these tiny details on. But I went in with a small brush and once again with scale 75's black, just painted some straight lines across it to create those hazard stripes. I then did two quick layered highlights on the black, one with Vallejo model colors German grey and the next with Vallejo model colors intermediate blue. I then used Elysian green and progressively adding more and more layers of Ogryn camo. I created some layered highlights on the commander's jacket. I then base coated all of the lenses with Scale 75's Fantasy and Games Despair Green. Now, I don't know exactly what happened here. I think I was feeling like the tank was a little bit bland and felt like it needed something, and then had the idea and got a little bit excited about doing this to it. So all I did was I taped off a section of the tank on either side, sprayed what was already there with the worn effects, and then added a layer of Games Workshop's Steel Legion drab, and then a layer of 50/50 Steel Legion drab and off-white from Vallejo, and then a layer of off-white from Vallejo. Once they dried, I then chipped them away and we're left with this. I found this to be a perfect spot to add some numbering on the model, so using some spare transfer sheets I had lying around, picked out a number and added those. I softened the transfer film with water and slid them onto an already prepped surface. This was Microsol on the surface of the model. Once that had dried, I put a layer of Micro Set on top of it and left it to dry. I then sealed those in by spraying the same matte varnish as before over the entire thing to give everything a nice uniform finish, as well as hide away any glossiness left from the transfer film. Using mixtures of Rhinox hide, the white and the green where the transfers were also sitting on top, I added chips to the transfers to make them feel like they were more embedded into the model. I then took the same oil wash mixture as before and added that to the white.
It's good to look back sometimes at the past, to the people and the things that we grew up with, simply for the sake of nostalgia. Because nostalgia enriches the spirit.
I then progressively added more and more of Games Workshop's Cyrobite green into the Despair green and blended up some little highlights for the lenses. You can see me sometimes going back and forth and adding more of the Despair green onto the shadows. This isn't an exact science. I just fiddled around with it until it looked good to me. I then finished that out by adding some white to the Cyrobite green and tracing the outer edges of all of the lenses. After that, I went to the opposite dark edge and added a dot of white for a little bit of a reflection and called them done. I then added some Vallejo Game Colors off-white into Games Workshop's Ogren Camo and went around and highlighted the entire tank. Now, I didn't do these edge highlights perfectly, and that was for a reason. This tank is damaged and beat up, so I wanted the highlights to kind of translate that. I didn't highlight parts that were already chipped. I kind of stippled highlights in some areas and just made it a little bit haphazard to get that effect across. I didn't think there was too much point to filming these next couple of steps because I've already done it on other parts of the model. I simply didn't do it then because I knew I would be handling those parts of the model. It's a big model, I'm gonna have to handle some point, so I decided to leave this to the end. I simply base coated all of the tank treads with the same exhaust manifold metal color as before, hit it with that same black brown wash and I'll let that dry. The next step was to mix some of Vallejo's rust pigments in with some isopropyl alcohol, and I went over the tank treads for that. Once that's dried, you can see that gives us a lovely rust effect. The next step is to take the same color we used before for highlighting all of the steel, the Model Air Silver, and dry brush stipple areas kind of on the higher edges that would be, obviously they're tank treads, they're going to be beat up and bruised, so rust is going to get scratched off and show bare metal underneath. And with that, I'm calling this tank done. This was a super fun project, kind of spurred on by a long-time love of Krieg, and yeah, a very timely find. Now, I'm not keeping this miniature. As I said before, this is going to be given away to one of my patrons. So if you would like to join my Patreon and help support make these videos, I would super appreciate it. And I hope I'm showing my appreciation by giving this guy away. I'm going to be announcing that in about 2 weeks. The announcement will go up on my Patreon. So yeah, if you want to go and support, you can have access to that for just a few bucks. Thank you again for watching. If you learned anything, found this video helpful, please leave a like, subscribe, comment what you may want to see from me next time, and I'll see you guys in the next video.